Between the 12th and 15th centuries, the Novgorod Republic established itself as a wealthy trading nation in northern Europe during a time dominated by widespread feudalism and monarchies. During the Northern Crusades, they halted Catholic incursions into their territory, protecting Eastern Orthodoxy. At a time when the Mongol invasions decimated other regions, they not only survived but thrived. This resilience and adaptability not only shaped the cultural and political landscape of the region, but also laid the groundwork for the Russian identity before the reign of any influential czar. To understand the Novgorod Republic, we need to understand the Kievan Rus. Prior to the creation of any centralized states, the area of Novgorod was inhabited by Slavic tribes. However, in the 9th century, these tribes, sick of warring with one another, decided to unite. Around this time, the Varangians, Viking conquerors, traders, and settlers from modern-day Sweden, were establishing their presence in the region. And in 862, the Slavic tribes famously invited the Varangian brothers, Rurik, Sineas, and Thruver, to rule Novgorod. Rurik's successor, Oleg the Wise, conquered more of the Slavic tribes and eventually annexed Kiev, founding the Kievan Rus. Early on in the Kievan Rus' history, Novgorod was under the thumb of the Kievan princes, annually paying tributes to them, yet despite this, it retained its status as an important city within the kingdom. As the Kievan Rus began to decline, Novgorod gained more power, and in 1019, Grand Prince of Kiev Yaroslav the Wise granted them independence as a vassal state. His son, Vladimir of Novgorod, built monumental sites such as the Novgorod Detonets and Cathedral of St. Sophia. During the 12th century, the Kievan Rus began to decline in power, and its grip over Novgorod declined with it. In 1136, the people of Novgorod expelled their prince, Vsevolod of Pskov, and became a republic, appointing Sviatoslav Olgovich as their first prince. The republic's decision-making was run by the Vichey, a popular assembly made up of people from all social classes, although heavily influenced by the boyars or nobility. The Vichey had the power to appoint and remove princes, declare wars, create and remove laws, and determine taxes. The Vichey also elected the Polsudnik, the prince's representative, and the Tisiatsky, who was in charge of the military. This system was essentially unheard of in the feudal, restricted societies of Europe. The Novgorod Republic's main rise to glory came from trade. The city of Novgorod was established alongside the Varangian trade routes that connected it with the Greeks, and it also had connections with the Hanseatic League, a collection of cities along the North and Baltic Seas. Novgorod primarily exported furs, honey, wax, leather, and fish, and imported silver, cloth, wine, salt, and food, primarily herring. As a matter of fact, the eastern side of the city of Novgorod was primarily dedicated to trade, containing rows of markets and shops. Early on in its history, this new republic was plagued by foreign enemies. In the east, the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people from Central Asia, raided across the Kievan Rus and Novgorod. In 1185, Igor Sviatoslav, son of the first prince, scored a victory against the Cumans before his eventual defeat and capture on the Kyala River, which is more or less the Russian culture. And don't worry, he escaped. The Cumans would eventually switch targets, raiding the Principality of Pereyaslav. In the west, the Novgorodians were threatened by the Catholic Crusader states in the Baltic. Some quick context. The Baltic was one of the last pagan regions in Europe, and so, in 1195, under the call of Pope Celestine III, states in northern Europe invaded the Baltic with the intent of Christianization. The Novgorod Republic was a Christian state. However, they were Eastern Orthodox, so it was still a target of the Catholic Crusaders. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the Swedish and the Novgorodians fought multiple wars against each other as the Swedes expanded east into the area around the Gulf of Finland, and by 1216, the Pope recognized Swedish rule over Finland. Russian sources claim that in 1240, the Novgorodians, under Alexander Nevsky, defeated the Swedes at the Battle of the Neva. The Swedes were bad enough, but the Republic also had to face the Teutonic Order and the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, the predecessors to the Livonian Order, an autonomous chapter of the Teutonic Order. The Livonians established a border with the Novgorodian Republic, and tensions immediately flared. In 1242, with the request of Pope Gregory IX, the Teutonic and Livonian orders invaded the Republic, and were swiftly defeated and massacred at the Battle on the Ice, halting any further incursions into Novgorodian land. At this point, you think that the battered Novgorod Republic would finally catch a breath. Well, if you did, you'd be wrong. You see, while the Novgorodians were fighting the Crusader states in the west, the Mongols were rapidly expanding across Eurasia, and this brought them in contact with the weakened Kievan Rus. And if you're familiar with them, you've probably heard of their brutality. The Mongols had also sacked many other Rus cities, so it's safe to say Novgorod was freaking out. So what was their grand strategy? A stalwart defense? A suicidal attack? Well, it was a bit underwhelming. Novgorod's prince Alexander Nevsky decided to, drumroll please, submit to the Mongol hordes.
What?
But wait, you might be asking yourself, why? Well, the Mongols were brutal conquerors, but so long as you swore loyalty to the Khan and paid tribute, they were relatively light rulers. They didn't care much for governance or culture or anything else. You might also be asking yourself why Novgorod didn't pay off the Crusaders. Well, they were the exact opposite. The Catholic Crusaders came east with the intent of converting the pagans in the Baltic, and as far as they were concerned, the Eastern Orthodox Novgorodians weren't any better. They were just as ready to dismantle the Republic, its culture, and its very identity in the name of God. So, it makes sense why they were willing to fight off the Crusaders and submit to Mongol authority. Alexander Nevsky's submission to the Khan also had political benefits, as he was granted the title of Grand Prince of Kiev, which greatly elevated his status. He ruled over a massive domain, but this wasn't bound to last. So, like all of us, Alexander Nevsky is mortal, making him susceptible to death. And so, on November 14th, 1263, Alexander Nevsky died at the ripe old age of 42. One of his sons, Daniel of Moscow, inherited the Principality of Moscow, which would eventually become the dominant state in the region. But it wasn't just the Muscovites. The Principality of Tver and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania also vied to dominate the declining republic. With the permission of the Mongols, Mikhail of Tver sent governors to Novgorod, which the Novgorodians deeply disliked. This decision brought them closer to the Muscovites. Novgorod would become a vassal state of the Muscovites in 1327. In 1348, Magnus Eriksson, king of Sweden, invaded Novgorod, and, taking advantage of this situation, the city of Pskov pressured Novgorod to give them independence, which they did following the signing of the Treaty of Boletovo in 1348. In the end, the Principality of Moscow would come out on top, and, under rulers like Ivan I and Simeon of Moscow, it began to limit Novgorod's power. From 1425 to 1453, the Principality of Moscow had a succession crisis, and Novgorod supported Dmitry Shemyaka. This proved to be a mistake, as he lost the Muscovite War of Succession, and his new prince, Vasily II, was infuriated. He launched a war against Novgorod, and, in 1456, Novgorod signed the Treaty of Yazhovitsy, which banned Novgorod from housing enemies of Vasily II, revoked Novgorod's right to conduct an independent foreign policy, and passed its legislation, greatly weakening Novgorod's Vichy. Around 1470, pro-Lithuanian factions within the weakened Novgorod Vichy questioned Ivan III's reign, and so they negotiated with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to appoint Mikhailo Oleghovich as the new Prince of Novgorod. However, this violated the Treaty of Yazhovitsy, and Ivan III invaded in 1471, scoring a decisive victory at the Battle of Shalon. This allowed the Novgorod lose territory and more of its independence, yet the city itself maintained some independence. Finally, in 1478, the Principality of Moscow invaded and officially annexed the Republic, famously tearing down the Vichy Bell that called meetings in the city. The Novgorod Chronicle states, thus, did great Prince Ivan advance with all his host against his domain of Novgorod because of the rebellious spirit of its people, their pride, and conversion to Latinism. With the great and overwhelming force did he occupy the entire territory of Novgorod from frontier to frontier, inflicting on every part of it the dread powers of his fire and sword. From this point, the Duchy of Moscow would become the undisputed master of the region. So, in conclusion, while an underrated state in European history, the Novgorod Republic is definitely worth remembering. From its resistance to the Teutonic and Livonian orders in the 13th century and its submission to the Mongols, the Republic dealt with enemies left and right. Yet, it maintained a powerful economy in Northern Europe, one that, in the end, ultimately attracted the wrong attention.